Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to an ancient city where fresh water was precious. Public fountains never seemed quite close enough, and even the clouds above could quietly become a source of remarkable fortune. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these quiet journeys through history. It helps the channel more than most medieval rulers ever helped their kingdoms. Now, lower the lights if you haven't already. Find a comfortable place to rest. Let your breathing slow a little. And together, let's wander into the streets of ancient Rome, where marble monuments reached proudly toward the sky, sandals echoed across worn stone roads, and somewhere between the rooftops, another small shower of rain was about to become unexpectedly valuable. When most people imagine Rome, they picture towering aqueducts stretching confidently across the countryside. Those graceful arches have become almost inseparable from the image of the Roman Empire itself. They carried enormous quantities of fresh water over remarkable distances, supplying cities that, by ancient standards, seemed almost impossibly large. The aqueducts deserve their reputation. They were extraordinary achievements of engineering. But they were never the whole story. For every magnificent public fountain fed by distant springs, there were thousands of roofs quietly collecting rain. Water, after all, had many lives before reaching a drinking cup. Some arrived through public channels, maintained by imperial officials. Some emerged from private wells, dug patiently into the earth. Some was purchased. Some was borrowed. Some simply fell from the sky and landed exactly where gravity decided. Unlike taxes, rain rarely asked permission. That made it one of nature's more agreeable habits. Roman households understood this long before engineers carved channels through mountains. Rainwater was not merely something that interrupted an afternoon walk. It represented opportunity, especially in places where dependable water was difficult to obtain or expensive to transport. Many Roman homes were designed with this quiet practicality in mind. If we step through the entrance of a comfortable urban house, a domus owned by a reasonably prosperous family, we might first notice the cool shade after leaving the bright Mediterranean sun. The noise of the street softens behind us. Ahead lies the atrium, the central hall that served as both reception room and heart of the household. In its roof sits a carefully designed opening known as the compluvium. Directly beneath, it rests a shallow basin called the impluvium. When rain arrived, water slipped through the opening almost effortlessly. It gathered in the stone basin before flowing into underground cisterns, where it could be stored for weeks or even months. The arrangement was elegant in its simplicity. No complicated machinery, no steam, no pumps. Just careful planning and patience. The Romans possessed a remarkable talent for allowing gravity to perform most of the difficult work. Gravity, fortunately, never demanded higher wages. Of course, not every Roman lived in such comfort. Most residents of the capital occupied crowded apartment buildings known as insulae. These structures rose several stories high and housed an astonishing number of people. From the outside, they appeared lively and practical. Inside, they could be noisy, smoky, cramped, and occasionally alarming from an architectural perspective. Building regulations existed. Following them consistently proved rather more challenging. Many tenants depended almost entirely upon nearby public fountains for their daily supply of fresh water. This meant carrying heavy buckets through busy streets every single day. One can imagine that missing the morning queue was somewhat inconvenient. Missing it during a particularly hot Roman summer was considerably worse. Daily life revolved around water in ways modern people rarely notice. Today, many of us twist a handle without giving the matter another thought. Ancient Romans devoted genuine portions of each day simply to obtaining enough water for drinking, cooking, washing, and cleaning. A reliable supply represented comfort. An abundant supply suggested prosperity. A private supply hinted at status. And status, as Rome repeatedly demonstrated, could become almost as addictive as wealth itself. The city grew steadily larger over the centuries. At its height, Rome may have held close to 1 million inhabitants, though historians continue to debate the exact figure. Whatever the true number, it was enormous by ancient standards. Feeding such a population required organization. Providing water required something even more difficult: consistency. The responsibility eventually fell to officials whose work most emperors preferred not to think about, unless something stopped functioning. One particularly valuable source comes from Sextus Julius Frontinus, appointed water commissioner during the reign of Emperor Nerva in the late 1st century A.D. Frontinus left behind a detailed account describing Rome's aqueduct system, its maintenance, its administration, and, perhaps most revealingly, the many creative ways citizens attempted to steal water. Human ingenuity, it seems, often flourishes most enthusiastically when avoiding utility bills. Frontinus described unauthorized pipes secretly attached to public lines. Some landowners enlarged their legal connections without permission. Others bribed workers responsible for inspections. Water leakage existed. Water theft existed. Bureaucratic headaches existed. Some aspects of civilization appear wonderfully timeless. Yet even these elaborate aqueducts could not solve every problem. Their water served public baths, fountains, ornamental displays, workshops, gardens, and private customers who possessed the legal right, and often sufficient money, to receive direct connections. The privilege did not extend equally to everyone. Rome remained a society deeply aware of hierarchy. An emperor demonstrated power through grand construction projects. A senator displayed influence through estates and lavish banquets. A wealthy merchant might display success through imported marble, expensive fish sauce, or a household with enough servants that someone else always carried the water. Luxury frequently involved convincing others to perform uncomfortable tasks. It is an arrangement with remarkable historical longevity. Let's drift gently toward another corner of Roman life. Imagine the countryside surrounding the city. Vineyards stretch across rolling hills. Olive trees twist quietly beneath the afternoon sun. Country villas stand among carefully managed estates, their white walls reflecting bright summer light. Here, rain mattered just as much, perhaps even more. Agriculture depended upon seasonal weather, and although the Mediterranean climate offered dependable rhythms, nature occasionally developed independent opinions. One year brought generous rainfall. Another delivered stubborn drought. Farmers watched the sky with practiced eyes. They noticed clouds gathering beyond distant hills. They recognized shifting winds. They understood that a week of steady rain could transform a harvest, while several dry months might quietly erase profits accumulated over many years. Roman writers devoted surprising attention to these observations. Cato the Elder, Varro, Columella, and later Pliny the Elder all discussed agriculture in considerable detail. Their works reveal a society deeply connected to seasonal patterns. They advised when to plant, when to prune, when to harvest, when to expect storms, and, occasionally, how to avoid making expensive mistakes. Advice that many landowners accepted only after making the expensive mistake first. Rainwater itself possessed advantages beyond mere availability. Because it had not traveled through mineral-rich springs, it could be softer than some groundwater sources. Certain households preferred it for washing delicate fabrics. Others used it in gardens or workshops. Cisterns became essential pieces of domestic architecture throughout much of Italy and the wider empire. Some were modest. Others were astonishing. Beneath prosperous villas lay vast underground chambers lined carefully with waterproof mortar. These reservoirs remained cool, even during intense summer heat. Workers inspected them regularly, removing sediment and repairing cracks before valuable supplies escaped into surrounding soil. Maintenance rarely inspired poetry. Ignoring maintenance often inspired disasters. Roman engineers understood this principle exceptionally well. Their buildings still remind us of that understanding nearly 2,000 years later. Even so, water could never be separated entirely from economics. Suppose a merchant owned several warehouses near the bustling port of Ostia, where grain ships arrived from Egypt and North Africa. Hundreds of laborers unloaded cargo beneath relentless sunshine. Animals required drinking water. Sailors needed fresh supplies before returning to sea. Every amphora filled, every barrel stored, every cistern maintained. Each represented practical value. No one advertised rain itself for sale, as though packaging clouds into neat commercial products. Yet collecting, storing, transporting, and providing access to water certainly created opportunities for profit. The business was rarely glamorous. Neither were most profitable businesses. History has a habit of celebrating victorious generals, while quietly overlooking the people who ensured everyone else had enough clean water to continue functioning. On the royal misery scale, carrying buckets uphill every morning scores a respectable 7 out of 10. Owning the cistern at the top of that hill, by contrast, tends to improve one's outlook considerably. As evening settled over Rome, the city changed its rhythm. The heat softened. Lamps flickered behind windows. Bakers prepared tomorrow's bread. Tavern conversations drifted into narrow streets. Somewhere nearby, the steady trickle of collected rainwater echoed softly within an underground cistern, unseen by nearly everyone passing above it. Few people would have paused to admire such a sound. Yet without it, Rome itself would have been a very different place. And in that quiet dependence on something as ordinary as falling rain, the foundations of an unexpectedly profitable world were already taking shape. Morning arrived gently over Rome, not with silence but with a slow gathering of familiar sounds. Wooden shutters creaked open one by one. Merchants swept yesterday's dust from the entrances of their shops. Bakers had already been awake for hours, and the smell of fresh bread drifted through streets that would soon become crowded with senators in bright white togas, laborers carrying impossible-looking loads, and children who somehow managed to find enough energy to race through narrow alleyways before breakfast. The city rarely stopped moving. It merely changed pace. And beneath much of that movement flowed an invisible network of water, some racing through aqueducts high above the countryside, some resting quietly beneath houses in underground cisterns, patiently waiting for the next bucket to descend. The Romans admired grand engineering, and with good reason. Visitors approaching the city often saw the great aqueducts long before they entered its gates. Miles of carefully measured channels crossed valleys on graceful arches before disappearing beneath the ground again, carrying spring water with remarkable precision. It looked effortless. It was anything but. Surveyors spent months calculating gentle slopes that modern eyes would barely notice. Stonecutters shaped thousands of blocks. Laborers hauled materials through difficult terrain. Engineers constantly worried about erosion, leaks, and the occasional landslide that seemed determined to disagree with their calculations. Nature was cooperative only when it felt inclined. Fortunately for Rome, Roman engineers were remarkably patient. Water traveled entirely by gravity. There were no engines pushing it forward. Every drop depended on careful planning from the source to its destination. If the slope became too steep, the current could damage the channel. If it became too shallow, the water might simply refuse to continue its journey. Gravity, once again, performed the difficult work. The engineers merely persuaded it in the correct direction. By the 2nd century, several aqueducts supplied the capital. Each drew water from different springs, some many dozens of kilometers away. The quality varied. Certain sources were considered better for drinking. Others supplied fountains, baths, or industrial activities. The Romans paid surprisingly close attention to such distinctions. Not every cup of water tasted the same. Not every spring earned the same reputation. Even in antiquity, people enjoyed expressing opinions about drinking water with considerable confidence. Meanwhile, away from the monumental structures that impressed travelers, thousands of homeowners were thinking about something much simpler. Their roofs. A Roman roof represented more than shelter. During every storm, it became a collection surface. Terracotta tiles guided rainfall toward carefully positioned gutters. Those channels directed water into the central opening of the house or toward external storage systems, depending upon the design. Good builders understood angles almost instinctively. Poor builders often learned about them during the first heavy rain. Repairs usually followed. The fortunate families who possessed large cisterns regarded every winter shower almost as an investment quietly arriving from the heavens. Rain that disappeared into the storage chambers below would eventually wash clothes, water gardens, cool kitchens, clean floors, or provide reserve supplies during dry periods. Very little was wasted. Roman households understood economy in practical ways. A wealthy family might decorate dining rooms with imported marble from Greece or Egypt, commission colorful frescoes covering entire walls, and serve guests exotic foods from distant provinces. Yet the same household often maintained its rainwater system with careful attention, because extravagance and practicality were never entirely incompatible. One paid for appearances. The other kept the household functioning. If given the choice, most sensible Romans preferred both. Imagine entering one of these homes during a gentle autumn shower. The rain falls steadily through the opening in the roof into the polished stone basin below. Tiny ripples spread across its surface, while servants quietly continue their duties around the atrium. No one panics. No one rushes to cover the opening. The house was built precisely for this moment. Nature had become part of the architecture. There is something strangely calming about that arrangement. Modern buildings generally try to keep weather outside. Romans occasionally invited it into the middle of the house, provided, of course, it behaved itself. Elsewhere, public fountains became gathering places throughout the city. Their importance extended beyond simple hydration. Neighbors exchanged news while waiting their turn. Travelers filled containers before continuing their journeys. Children played nearby until someone reminded them that soaking one's sandals before breakfast was an entirely avoidable inconvenience. Water shaped conversations. It shaped routines. It even shaped friendships. Standing in line together every morning tends to make strangers somewhat familiar over time. The fountains themselves varied considerably. Some were modest basins, supplied by lead or terracotta pipes. Others displayed elaborate carvings of gods, dolphins, sea creatures, or heroic figures, whose expressions suggested they had personally invented fresh water. Roman public art occasionally displayed remarkable confidence. Maintenance crews inspected pipes regularly because leaks reduced pressure throughout the network. Sediment accumulated gradually inside channels. Tree roots developed unfortunate habits of growing exactly where engineers wished they would not. Repair work never truly ended. Empires expanded. Roads stretched farther. New monuments appeared. But someone always had to clean the pipes. History remembers emperors rather more enthusiastically than maintenance workers. This seems slightly unfair. One curious feature of Roman water management involved law. The empire loved laws. It produced them with admirable enthusiasm. Water rights occupied an important place among them. Official permission was often required before connecting private properties to aqueduct supplies. Unauthorized diversions could result in penalties, confiscation, or expensive legal disputes. Frontinus complained that illegal pipes appeared with surprising frequency. Apparently, whenever valuable resources become available, someone eventually decides that permission is merely an interesting suggestion. The authorities disagreed. Inspectors measured pipe diameters carefully because larger pipes delivered more water. Some owners attempted to enlarge their connections after approval had already been granted. A tiny adjustment here, a discreet alteration there. Surely no one would notice. Someone usually did. Roman bureaucracy possessed many flaws. Complete blindness was not generally among them. Of course, rainwater existed outside much of this regulatory system because it fell naturally onto private property. Collecting it required construction, storage, and maintenance rather than official distribution. For household use, it represented independence. Independence carried value, especially during shortages. Imagine a particularly dry summer. Public fountains still flowed, but less generously. Queues became longer. Tempers became shorter. Farmers watched cloudless skies with growing concern, while city officials quietly reviewed available reserves. Households with well-maintained cisterns slept somewhat more comfortably. planning several seasons earlier, now produced quiet rewards. Rome rarely lacked ambitious individuals eager to recognize opportunities, hiding inside ordinary necessities. Some invested in grain, others in shipping, others purchased rental housing. Still others accumulated agricultural estates producing olives or wine. Each carried risks. Harvests failed. Ships sank. Buildings burned. Markets fluctuated. The weather ignored everyone's financial expectations equally. Yet almost every enterprise depended upon dependable water somewhere along the chain. Wine required vineyards. Vineyards required rain. Olives required careful irrigation during difficult years. Construction required water for mortar. Public baths consumed astonishing quantities daily. Metal workers cooled equipment. Dyers processed cloth. Leather workers prepared hides. Bakers kneaded dough. Potters mixed clay. Even the fish sauce factories, famous throughout the empire for producing garum with aromas that modern neighbors might politely describe as memorable, relied heavily upon reliable supplies for cleaning equipment. Water quietly supported nearly everything. It rarely demanded applause. Perhaps that is why it became so easy to overlook. Let's drift gently toward another Roman household. This one belongs not to a senator, but to a prosperous merchant whose fortunes have risen through years of careful trading. His clothing is respectable rather than extravagant. His dining room is comfortable, without attempting to rival imperial palaces. He owns several warehouses and employs clerks capable of reading accounts with enviable accuracy. He also understands storage. Whether grain, olive oil, wine, or water, storing valuable resources safely often proves more profitable than acquiring them in the first place. His builders, therefore, constructed generous underground cisterns beneath both his residence and portions of his commercial property. When seasonal rains arrive, they fill gradually. The merchant does not stand outside celebrating each shower. Successful Romans generally preferred quieter demonstrations of satisfaction. Instead, he reviews accounts while servants inspect gutters and filters, ensuring leaves, dust, and debris do not contaminate the supply. It is careful, ordinary work. Ordinary work has built surprising fortunes throughout history. There is a temptation to imagine wealth appearing dramatically through sudden discoveries or spectacular victories. Reality often prefers bookkeeping and clean gutters. One Roman writer observed that successful estate management depended less upon brilliant inspiration than consistent attention. Fields required inspection. Buildings required repair. Workers required supervision. Accounts required balancing. Nothing about the routine sounded especially exciting. That may explain why it worked so well. Meanwhile, beyond the city itself, travelers crossing Italy encountered another familiar sight. Roadside inns. Some offered decent meals. Others offered experiences best forgotten. Fresh water became one of the simplest ways an innkeeper distinguished respectable accommodation from somewhere guests hoped to leave before sunrise. On the royal misery scale, spending the night at an establishment with suspicious stew and unreliable water earns a thoughtful 8 out of 10. Many travelers preferred paying slightly more for cleaner surroundings. Some lessons have remained remarkably consistent across 2 millennia. As another Roman day slowly unfolded, sunlight reflected from tiled roofs still damp after an overnight shower. Beneath those roofs, unseen reservoirs quietly held yesterday's rain, waiting patiently for tomorrow's needs. Few passers-by gave them a second thought. Yet hidden below their feet rested one of the city's most dependable forms of wealth. Not dazzling, not glamorous, but dependable. And in ancient Rome, dependability often proved far more valuable than spectacle. As the morning gradually surrendered to afternoon, Rome settled into its familiar rhythm of purposeful activity. The sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows beneath colonnades and turning pale stone streets almost dazzling to the eye. Merchants pulled woven awnings across the fronts of their shops, creating narrow strips of welcome shade. Donkeys continued their patient work, apparently convinced that the entire empire depended upon their willingness to carry one more load. In many respects, they were not entirely wrong. An empire, after all, rested upon countless ordinary tasks completed by ordinary people. Few Romans woke each morning expecting to change history. Most simply hoped their roof would not leak in the wrong place. Water remained at the center of these quiet routines. A household servant might begin the day by checking the level inside a cistern. A gardener examined whether yesterday's watering had been sufficient for herbs, fruit trees, or decorative flowers surrounding a villa. A baker measured carefully how much water should be mixed with flour before sunrise. Somewhere across the city, a physician washed instruments before visiting patients, while a mason preparing fresh mortar silently thanked whoever had remembered to refill the storage jars. The work differed. The dependence did not. One of Rome's greatest strengths was its remarkable ability to transform practical necessities into organized systems. Roads connected provinces. Warehouses stored grain. Harbors received ships from every corner of the Mediterranean. Aqueducts carried spring water across astonishing distances. None of these systems functioned perfectly. Romans would probably have been the first to admit that. Even the most impressive engineering required constant supervision. Frontinus, the water commissioner whose careful observations have survived the centuries, understood this perhaps better than anyone. His writings reveal not merely admiration for Rome's aqueducts, but concern for their maintenance. He worried about damaged channels, careless repairs, unauthorized connections, and officials who occasionally displayed more confidence than competence. Competence, unfortunately, has always been slightly more difficult to acquire than confidence. Inspectors walked long sections of aqueduct, searching for cracks or weakened masonry. Small leaks might seem harmless, but over time they wasted considerable amounts of water. More importantly, neglected damage often grew into expensive repairs. Roman administrators appreciated prevention, mostly because rebuilding entire structures tended to become rather costly. Water itself also demanded attention after reaching the city. Lead pipes distributed supplies across neighborhoods, while stone channels directed water toward fountains, baths, and reservoirs. Contrary to popular imagination, Romans did not simply allow water to wander wherever it pleased. It received directions, quite detailed ones. Engineers measured gradients with extraordinary care, ensuring that gravity remained an enthusiastic partner rather than an inconvenient obstacle. One cannot negotiate with gravity. The Romans wisely chose cooperation instead. Meanwhile, rainwater followed a quieter path. No grand arches announced its arrival. No triumphal inscriptions celebrated another successful storm. Instead, it slipped silently from roof tiles into carefully built cisterns, where darkness and cool temperatures helped preserve it. Many underground reservoirs were lined with waterproof mortar made from lime mixed with volcanic ash. This remarkable material resisted moisture exceptionally well, contributing to the surprising durability of Roman construction. It also explains why archaeologists continue discovering ancient cisterns in remarkably good condition. Stone, when treated kindly, possesses admirable patience. Imagine standing inside one of these underground chambers. The air feels noticeably cooler than outside. Moisture clings gently to the walls. The only sound is the occasional drop of water echoing softly through the stillness. Above your head, an entire household continues its daily routine, mostly unaware of the quiet reservoir supporting life beneath their feet. There is something almost peaceful about such hidden infrastructure. The most important parts of civilization are often invisible. Visitors admired temples. Residents appreciated plumbing. As one problem slowly faded, another quietly appeared. The Roman Empire never lacked ambitious building projects. New neighborhoods expanded. Old houses received improvements. Public baths became larger and more elaborate. Gardens demanded irrigation. Fountains multiplied throughout prosperous districts. Every improvement required water. Demand steadily increased. Supply, although impressive, always had practical limits. This encouraged careful thinking among wealthy landowners. Those fortunate enough to possess spacious estates often invested heavily in rainwater collection, not because they distrusted aqueducts, but because multiple sources offered security. If one system experienced disruption, another remained available. Diversification, it turns out, did not begin with modern investment advisors. Nature had been encouraging it for centuries. Roman agricultural writers repeatedly emphasized preparation. Columella, one of antiquity's most respected authorities on farming, discussed estate management with almost relentless thoroughness. Buildings should be inspected regularly. Equipment should remain in good condition. Workers required organization. Water storage deserved careful attention before dry weather arrived. Waiting until the cistern stood empty generally indicated poor planning. Some lessons refused to become outdated. The countryside surrounding Rome reflected this philosophy. Large estates often included multiple cisterns positioned near vineyards, olive groves, kitchens, workshops, and livestock enclosures. Rain falling during winter months quietly accumulated for future use. Nothing dramatic occurred. No ceremonies celebrated a full reservoir. Success announced itself through ordinary reliability. Animals continued drinking. Gardens remained healthy. Workers completed their tasks. Life proceeded with remarkably little interruption. Quiet success rarely attracts historians. It probably deserves more attention than it receives. Let's drift gently toward the bustling port of Ostia. Here, the atmosphere differed completely from the quieter countryside. Ships crowded the harbor after long voyages from Spain, Egypt, North Africa, Greece, and the eastern Mediterranean. Sailors shouted instructions while dockworkers rolled barrels, stacked amphorae, and recorded cargoes arriving from provinces separated by weeks of travel. The air carried a mixture of salt, timber, olive oil, spices, fish, and smoke. It was not everyone's preferred perfume. Business, however, rarely concerned itself with pleasant aromas. Fresh water remained indispensable here as well. Crews arriving after days or weeks at sea required reliable supplies before departing again. Storage vessels had to be cleaned. Animals unloaded from transport ships needed drinking water. Workshops operating near the harbor consumed significant quantities every day. The movement of commerce depended upon surprisingly ordinary resources. Water ranked among the most important. A merchant owning warehouses near Ostia understood this instinctively. Warehouse roofs became collection surfaces. Courtyards directed runoff into underground tanks. Rain falling freely from the sky entered carefully managed storage systems, capable of supporting both household and commercial activities. No invoice accompanied the rainfall. Construction and maintenance, however, certainly did. Profiting from water seldom involved selling individual buckets to passing strangers. Instead, wealth emerged through ownership of the infrastructure surrounding storage, transport, agriculture, manufacturing, rental properties, and commercial facilities. Rain itself remained free. Access to dependable supplies often did not. It is a distinction that quietly shaped economies throughout history. One curious feature of Roman thinking involved fortune itself. The goddess Fortuna occupied an important place within Roman religion. She represented luck, chance, prosperity, and the unpredictable nature of human life. Many sought her favor. Few fully understood her methods. A prosperous harvest followed by drought. A profitable voyage followed by shipwreck. A fortunate marriage followed by an awkward inheritance dispute. Fortuna displayed little interest in consistency. Roman writers frequently reflected upon this uncertainty. Success required effort. It also required circumstances beyond anyone's control. Rain illustrated this beautifully. No emperor commanded storms with genuine authority. No senator voted clouds into existence. Priests conducted ceremonies seeking divine favor, yet weather retained its familiar independence. When rain finally arrived after weeks of dry skies, practical Romans wasted very little time celebrating. They collected it. Efficiency often proved more useful than optimism. Meanwhile, inside Rome itself, the great public baths welcomed visitors throughout the day. These immense complexes ranked among the city's greatest achievements. They were far more than places to wash. People exercised, read, discussed politics, conducted business, met friends, listened to philosophers, and occasionally accomplished remarkably little while insisting they were extremely busy. The baths required astonishing quantities of water. Hot pools, warm pools, cold pools, steam rooms, fountains, gardens, cleaning, maintenance. Everything depended upon uninterrupted supply. Imperial authorities therefore devoted considerable attention to ensuring that these facilities continued operating smoothly. Closing the baths unexpectedly would have created widespread dissatisfaction. Governments throughout history have generally preferred avoiding unnecessary dissatisfaction. Some strategies age surprisingly well. On the royal misery scale, Discovering that your favorite bathhouse has temporarily run out of water scores a respectable 6 out of 10. Discovering the cold plunge has unexpectedly become the only available option may increase that score rather quickly. Back inside a quieter Roman home, evening approached. The intense heat softened. Household servants lit oil lamps one by one. The impluvium in the center of the atrium reflected flickering light across painted walls. Somewhere beneath the polished floor, stored rainwater rested silently inside cool stone chambers, exactly where generations of careful builders intended it to remain. Guests arriving for dinner admired mosaics, sculptures, and carefully prepared meals. Few asked to inspect the cistern. Perhaps they should have. Without it, many of the comforts surrounding them would have been far less dependable. Civilization often hides its greatest achievements below ground, behind walls, or inside systems that function so reliably people forget they exist at all. The Romans understood spectacle. They also understood maintenance. And although triumphal arches earned more applause than underground reservoirs ever would, both played their part in supporting one of history's most remarkable cities. While senators debated policy beneath painted ceilings and merchants counted coins in shaded offices, countless drops of rain waited patiently beneath rooftops across the empire, quietly preparing to become tomorrow's bread, tomorrow's garden, tomorrow's bath, and tomorrow's prosperity. Night settled gently over the city, softening the sharp edges of Rome's magnificent buildings. The great temples that had gleamed beneath the afternoon sun now stood quietly beneath the light of countless oil lamps. Their marble columns reflected a warm golden glow rather than brilliant white, and the constant noise of commerce slowly gave way to quieter conversations, drifting through courtyards and narrow streets. Rome never truly became silent. It simply learned to whisper. In wealthier neighborhoods, dinner had become the evening's principal event. Guests reclined on cushioned couches surrounding polished tables, while servants carried dishes from the kitchen with practiced confidence. Bread still warm from the oven appeared beside bowls of olives, cheeses, vegetables seasoned with herbs, roasted meats for those who could afford them, and, naturally, generous amounts of wine diluted with water. Undiluted wine was generally considered uncivilized. The Romans had strong opinions about this. They possessed strong opinions about rather a great many things. The water mixed into that evening's wine might have traveled many different paths before reaching the cup. Perhaps it had flowed through one of the city's great aqueducts earlier that morning. Perhaps it had rested quietly within a private cistern after falling as rain several months before. Sometimes households even preferred blending different sources, depending on availability and intended use. Very little escaped careful consideration. Dinner itself could continue for hours. Not every gathering resembled the lavish feasts described by poets eager to entertain their audiences. Most Roman meals were considerably more ordinary. Families spoke about business, marriages, household affairs, legal disputes, and the endless practical concerns that seemed to accompany human civilization regardless of century. Some conversations probably sounded remarkably familiar. Someone worried about rising expenses. Someone complained about unreliable workers. Someone insisted everything had been better 20 years earlier. History changes. People perhaps slightly less so. Meanwhile, beneath the house, the cistern remained perfectly unconcerned with these discussions. Its purpose was wonderfully uncomplicated. Store the water. Keep it clean. Wait patiently. There is something almost admirable about infrastructure that never feels the need to announce its importance. As one Roman household prepared for sleep, another group remained very much awake. Watchmen walked slowly through darker streets carrying lanterns that cast small circles of flickering light across uneven paving stones. Their duties included watching for thieves, disturbances, and perhaps most dangerously, fire. Fire represented one of Rome's greatest fears. The city contained enormous quantities of timber. Apartment buildings stood close together. Oil lamps illuminated homes after sunset. Kitchens relied upon open flames. Under unfortunate conditions, disaster spread astonishingly quickly. Water therefore possessed another kind of value. Not merely comfort. Protection. Households storing generous quantities of water gained precious moments if flames appeared unexpectedly. Public authorities organized equipment for firefighting, though ancient methods naturally differed from modern expectations. Buckets remained surprisingly important. Technology evolves. The usefulness of a full bucket has endured with remarkable consistency. Large public reservoirs contributed to emergency efforts whenever possible, while private supplies occasionally became essential for protecting individual homes. Once again, rainwater quietly justified the effort invested in collecting it. Nobody admired a cistern more than someone standing near a fire. Let us wander beyond Rome itself for a while. Across Italy, hundreds of smaller towns faced different challenges than the imperial capital. Few possessed aqueduct systems approaching Rome's scale. Many depended heavily upon wells, springs, and carefully maintained rainwater reservoirs. The rhythm of life often followed the rhythm of the seasons. Winter storms filled storage tanks. Spring encouraged planting. Summer tested preparation. Autumn rewarded or punished the year's decisions. A farmer might spend months constructing stone-lined reservoirs without receiving immediate benefit. Neighbors could easily wonder whether such effort was worthwhile. Until the first difficult summer arrived. Preparation rarely appears impressive immediately. Its value often becomes obvious only when circumstances deteriorate. Roman agricultural writers understood this deeply. They advised landowners not to think merely about the present harvest, but several seasons ahead. Buildings should remain in good repair, because replacing collapsed roofs cost more than maintaining sound ones. Storage facilities deserved equal attention, because preserving resources usually proved easier than replacing them. There was very little glamour in preventive maintenance. There was usually even less glamour in ignoring it. One curious aspect of Roman engineering was its willingness to adapt local conditions rather than insist upon identical solutions everywhere. In mountainous regions, springs might provide abundant fresh water. Coastal settlements often relied more heavily upon cisterns. Dry provinces throughout North Africa developed enormous underground storage systems capable of preserving seasonal rainfall for remarkably long periods. The empire covered extraordinary distances. Practical knowledge traveled with it. Builders in one province learned from techniques developed in another. Engineers adapted familiar principles to unfamiliar landscapes. Governors funded improvements when finances permitted, and postponed them when finances stubbornly refused. Budgets have displayed remarkable independence throughout history. Not every governor enjoyed unlimited resources. Imagine visiting a prosperous villa in southern Italy during late summer. The vineyards surrounding the estate have begun producing heavy clusters of grapes. Olive trees shimmer silver green beneath warm afternoon breezes. Workers move steadily between fields while overseers keep careful records of labor, equipment, and expected harvests. The estate owner walks slowly through the property. His attention eventually turns toward the water storage system. He asks simple questions. How full are the cisterns? Have any cracks appeared? Were the filters cleaned after the last storm? Has enough water been reserved for the gardens? None of these questions sound particularly heroic. Successful estate management seldom does. History often remembers military victories. Fortunes, meanwhile, were frequently protected by someone remembering to inspect the gutters. Perhaps that deserves slightly more appreciation. Let's drift gently toward another Roman complication. Not everyone enjoyed equal access to water. Status mattered. Wealth mattered. Location mattered. A luxurious house connected legally to the aqueduct network offered conveniences unavailable to many ordinary citizens. Yet even prosperous households recognized that public systems occasionally required repairs. Political priorities shifted. Drought reduced available supplies. Private storage represented security. Security itself carried considerable value. Merchants understood this especially well. Suppose a warehouse owner maintained reliable water supplies on commercial property. Laborers loading grain beneath intense summer heat required drinking water. Pack animals transporting goods across dusty roads required water before beginning another journey. Cleaning storage areas reduced spoilage and preserved valuable merchandise. Every interruption carried financial consequences. Dependability therefore became quietly profitable. No customer admired an efficient drainage system. They appreciated receiving goods on time. Infrastructure rarely receives applause proportional to its importance. Perhaps because it performs best when nobody notices it at all. Roman law reflected these realities with surprising sophistication. Contracts occasionally addressed access to wells or shared water supplies. Property boundaries sometimes determined maintenance responsibilities for drainage channels. Neighbors disputed runoff, flooding, and rights associated with springs. Human beings have apparently argued about property lines for as long as property lines have existed. Surveyors found steady employment. Lawyers won suspects, did not suffer from a shortage of clients either. One particularly interesting feature of Roman houses involved the relationship between beauty and usefulness. The central atrium welcomed visitors with elegant proportions, painted walls, decorative statues, and carefully arranged furniture. Yet its famous opening in the roof existed primarily because it served a practical purpose. Rain entered deliberately. Architecture embraced necessity rather than hiding it. The result was unexpectedly graceful. A visitor admired aesthetics. The homeowner appreciated reliable water storage. Everyone left reasonably satisfied, except perhaps during unusually windy storms. Those occasionally introduced moisture into places moisture had not been invited. Nature enjoys reminding architects that complete control remains slightly optimistic. As darkness deepened, stars appeared above the city. Some Romans studied them carefully, believing celestial movements revealed something about fortune or destiny. Sailors relied upon them for navigation. Farmers watched seasonal constellations to judge the changing year. Meanwhile, clouds gathered quietly beyond distant hills. No announcement accompanied their arrival. No messenger hurried ahead. Sometime before dawn, rain would likely begin falling across tiled roofs, courtyards, gardens, and fields. Most people would remain asleep. The houses themselves, however, were ready. Water would slide along curved tiles, flow through stone channels, ripple gently into impluvia, disappear into cool underground chambers, and begin another patient season of waiting. On the royal misery scale, remembering to maintain your cistern before the rainy season scores a comfortable 2 out of 10. Forgetting entirely, only to discover the overflow has been feeding your neighbor's courtyard instead, climbs rather rapidly toward an 8. There is a quiet elegance in the way Roman builders accepted that prosperity often arrived one drop at a time. Not through spectacular discoveries, not through miraculous inventions, but through careful preparation repeated across months, years, and generations. While emperors celebrated victories beneath triumphal arches and poets composed verses honoring famous names, countless ordinary Romans continued performing smaller acts of diligence that rarely entered history books. They repaired roofs, cleaned gutters, inspected reservoirs, measured supplies, watched the weather, and without quite realizing it, they helped sustain one of the largest and most remarkable cities the ancient world had ever known. Before the first hint of sunrise touched the rooftops, Rome already belonged to those whose work began, while most of the city still dreamed. The baker had little interest in sleeping late. Neither did the miller. The dockworker loading grain onto wagons would have considered such an idea almost fictional. And somewhere in the growing darkness, a household steward quietly unlocked a storeroom, lit a small oil lamp, and began another ordinary inspection. The jars stood where they should. The grain remained dry. The wine amphorae were sealed. The cistern level appeared satisfactory. Everything seemed in order. There was a certain comfort in routines that changed very little from one day to the next. The Romans valued routine more than they often admitted. It is easy to imagine ancient life as a continuous procession of dramatic events, emperors announcing victories, senators arguing beneath painted ceilings, generals returning from distant frontiers. Most days were nothing like that. Most days consisted of maintenance. And maintenance, although rarely celebrated, quietly allowed everything else to exist. As dawn spread across the city, sunlight slowly reached the upper stories of the insulae, those crowded apartment buildings that housed a large portion of Rome's population. Life here differed greatly from the spacious homes of the wealthy. Families occupied modest rooms. Storage space remained limited. Private courtyards were uncommon. Few residents enjoyed the luxury of large underground rainwater reservoirs beneath their apartments. Instead, daily life depended upon public infrastructure. Someone needed water. Someone carried it. Someone waited in line. Someone inevitably complained that the queue had been shorter yesterday. Memory has always been surprisingly generous when recalling imaginary better times. The journey to a public fountain formed part of countless Roman mornings. Clay jars balanced against hips. Wooden buckets swung gently from carrying poles. Children accompanied parents, learning practical habits long before they learned philosophy or politics. Fresh water represented effort. Every filled container carried a little weight. Perhaps that explains why the Romans appeared less inclined to waste it than many modern societies. Abundance can quietly encourage carelessness. Scarcity often teaches precision. Meanwhile, in wealthier districts, servants completed similar tasks with noticeably less inconvenience. Private connections to the aqueducts supplied certain houses directly, while extensive cistern systems provided dependable reserves. A visitor arriving for breakfast might admire polished marble floors or colorful mosaics, without realizing that some of the household's greatest investments remained hidden beneath them. Underground, unseen, patiently waiting. There is a peculiar irony in architecture. The expensive decorations receive admiration. The foundations carry the weight. The Romans, to their credit, generally invested in both. Let us wander for a while into one of Rome's workshops. The smell reaches us before the doorway does. Leather workers occupied an important place within the urban economy, producing sandals, belts, harnesses, military equipment, bags, and countless everyday necessities. The process demanded water repeatedly. Hides required soaking, cleaning, softening, rinsing. Each stage depended upon reliable supplies. The finished products looked nothing like the raw materials from which they began. Transformation often appears almost magical when enough patient labor has occurred beforehand. Nearby, another workshop produces dyed cloth. Large vats stand arranged beneath partial shelter, while workers stir mixtures with practiced movements developed through years of experience. Different colors require different techniques. Some dyes cost astonishing sums. Purple, extracted from sea snails, became almost legendary for its expense. Water again played its quiet role. Without it, fabrics remained stubbornly unchanged. Without craftsmen, the empire dressed rather less elegantly. It is remarkable how often invisible resources support visible luxury. Perhaps nowhere illustrated this more clearly than Rome itself. The city dazzled visitors with monuments, triumphal arches, temples, theaters, and enormous public baths. Yet beneath that splendor lay pipes, drains, reservoirs, channels, sewers, and cisterns performing their duties without applause. Civilization often resembles a stage performance. The audience watches the actors. The machinery behind the curtain deserves equal admiration. As one problem slowly faded, another quietly appeared. Population growth brought prosperity, but also pressure. Every additional resident required drinking water. Every new bathhouse demanded supply. Every workshop competed for resources. Administrators therefore faced continual decisions regarding maintenance, expansion, and distribution. Not everyone agreed with those decisions. Few governments throughout history have enjoyed unanimous approval. Roman officials understood that water represented more than convenience. It touched public health, commerce, agriculture, industry, politics, even social status. Control over reliable resources frequently translated into influence. Influence in Rome could become nearly as valuable as coin itself. Consider the wealthy owner of several rental buildings. His income depended upon tenants remaining reasonably satisfied. Repairs therefore mattered. Roofs leaked occasionally. Drainage channels became blocked. Storage cisterns accumulated sediment. Neglecting such matters risked expensive consequences later. An attentive landlord protected his investment. An inattentive one generally acquired new opportunities to apologize. Whether those apologies proved convincing is another question entirely. Roman writers occasionally complained about careless property owners, suggesting that human beings have been promising repairs soon, for considerably longer than many tenants might appreciate. History can be strangely reassuring. Some frustrations are apparently timeless. Let's drift gently beyond Italy. Across the Roman Empire, local conditions shaped the relationship between people and water. In Britain, rainfall often arrived with generous enthusiasm. Residents probably wished it displayed slightly more restraint. In Egypt, conditions stood almost opposite. Life revolved around the Nile. Its annual flooding deposited fertile soil, while determining agricultural success across enormous regions. Rain itself contributed comparatively little. The empire, therefore, contained many different water cultures. Each developed practical solutions suited to local geography. Roman engineers rarely insisted upon identical designs everywhere. They adapted. Adaptation often proves more intelligent than stubborn consistency. North Africa offers particularly fascinating examples. Cities there constructed immense underground cistern complexes, capable of storing seasonal rainfall for remarkably long periods. Some survive today, demonstrating both impressive engineering and remarkable foresight. Builders understood that every drop collected during wetter months might become indispensable later. The future, after all, tends to arrive whether one prepares for it or not. Preparation simply makes the meeting more comfortable. One curious Roman habit involved keeping detailed financial accounts. Merchants tracked purchases carefully. Estate managers recorded harvests. Warehouse owners counted deliveries with impressive precision. Receipts existed. Contracts existed. Inventories existed. Successful commerce depended upon memory supported by writing, rather than memory alone. A sensible arrangement. Human memory occasionally develops creative interpretations of previous agreements. Ink generally argues more persuasively. Imagine a merchant reviewing his accounts near the end of summer. Income from grain. Expenses for transport. Payments to laborers. Repairs to warehouse roofs. Cleaning of drainage channels. Maintenance of storage cisterns. None of these entries seem especially exciting. Collectively, they determine whether the business prospers. Fortunes often emerge from columns of numbers rather than dramatic adventures. Reality has always possessed a slight preference for bookkeeping. Meanwhile, clouds gathered beyond the western horizon. Experienced farmers noticed them almost instinctively. They studied wind direction, the scent of the air, the behavior of birds, even the appearance of distant mountains. Weather forecasting in antiquity relied less upon instruments and more upon generations of observation. It was not perfect. Neither, to be fair, are many modern forecasts. Nature enjoys preserving a few surprises. The first raindrops arrived quietly. Dust settled. Warm stone released the earthy scent that follows long-awaited rain. Across the countryside, roofs began performing the task they had quietly prepared for all year. Water flowed into gutters. Gutters carried it toward storage. Reservoirs slowly filled. No celebration interrupted the work. Gravity remained wonderfully dependable. On the royal misery scale, spending weeks repairing your cistern only to watch the first heavy rain reveal one tiny leak you somehow overlooked earns a sympathetic 7 out of 10. The leak, naturally, appears in exactly the place most difficult to reach. As evening approached once more, Rome reflected another ordinary day successfully completed. Markets closed. Ships rested at anchor. Workshop fires cooled. Families gathered for supper. Children gradually surrendered their endless energy to sleep. And beneath countless homes, hidden from every passerby, rainwater rested silently inside stone-lined chambers. It asked for nothing. It attracted little attention. Yet it remained one of the quiet foundations upon which daily Roman life continued to build its remarkable endurance. Empires often celebrate conquest. Their greatest achievements, however, are sometimes found not on battlefields or triumphal arches, but beneath an ordinary roof, where yesterday's rainfall waits patiently to become tomorrow's necessity. The Roman day rarely announced itself with urgency. Instead, it unfolded gradually, almost politely, as pale morning light crept across tiled rooftops and the city stirred awake one household at a time. Somewhere a rooster declared victory over the sunrise, despite having very little influence over the matter. Nearby, the rhythmic tapping of a blacksmith's hammer began echoing through a side street, while a mule, displaying the quiet determination for which mules have long been admired, reluctantly accepted another day's work. For many Romans, the first practical concern remained exactly what it had been the day before: water. Not because it was unusual. Quite the opposite. Its reliability made it indispensable. A wealthy senator might spend the morning discussing provincial taxes or military appointments. A merchant might negotiate the price of olive oil arriving from Hispania. A teacher could gather young students beneath the shelter of a colonnade to explain the speeches of Cicero or the poetry of Virgil. Yet every one of them, whether they considered it or not, depended upon someone having collected, stored, protected, or transported water long before breakfast. It was the quiet partner in nearly every activity. And quiet partners rarely receive the recognition they deserve. Roman society possessed a remarkable appreciation for visible success. Victorious generals celebrated triumphs through the city. Wealthy patrons commissioned statues in their own honor. Public buildings carried inscriptions proudly announcing who had paid for their construction. Underground reservoirs received no such ceremonies. Nobody gathered to applaud an exceptionally well-maintained drainage channel. There were no festivals honoring a perfectly repaired gutter. History has always favored spectacle. Practicality usually worked behind the scenes. As the city warmed beneath the Mediterranean sun, another stream of visitors made its way toward one of Rome's greatest institutions: the public baths. To modern visitors, it may seem surprising that bathing occupied such an important place in Roman daily life. These enormous complexes functioned as community centers, as much as places for washing. Friends met there. Business arrangements quietly developed. Philosophers debated ideas. Athletes exercised before moving through rooms of gradually changing temperatures. Some visitors probably spent more time talking than bathing. Human priorities have remained remarkably consistent. A typical visit began in the apoditerium, the changing room, before moving through warm chambers toward the hotter rooms filled with steam. Finally came the refreshing plunge into cooler water. The entire experience depended upon astonishing quantities of fresh water flowing continuously through carefully engineered systems. Heating furnaces worked relentlessly beneath portions of the building. Workers maintained fires throughout the day. Pipes delivered fresh supplies, while drainage systems removed used water with equal efficiency. It represented engineering on an immense scale. Most visitors simply enjoyed the result. Very few paused to admire the plumbing. Perhaps they should have. There is an old tendency among civilizations to celebrate monuments while overlooking maintenance. The Romans occasionally resisted that temptation. Frontinus certainly did. His concern for Rome's aqueducts reveals a practical administrator who understood that greatness depended less upon construction than preservation. Building an aqueduct required enormous effort. Keeping it functioning required even more. A stone shifted, mortar weathered, channels accumulated mineral deposits, roots pushed patiently through tiny cracks. Water, although gentle, possessed extraordinary persistence. Given enough time, it reshaped almost everything. Nature often wins arguments through patience rather than force. Meanwhile, outside the capital, life moved at a calmer pace. In the rolling countryside of central Italy, vineyards stretched across gentle hillsides beneath broad blue skies. Farmers inspected vines carefully, looking for signs of healthy fruit or unwelcome disease. Olive groves shimmered softly whenever the breeze crossed their silvery leaves. The landscape appeared peaceful. It also demanded constant work. Agriculture rewarded consistency more than brilliance. Fields required attention regardless of festivals, elections, or imperial ceremonies. Rain remained both blessing and uncertainty. Too little threatened harvests. Too much damaged them. The ideal season existed mostly in agricultural manuals. Reality preferred compromise. Roman farmers therefore became keen observers of the natural world. They watched birds changing their patterns. They noticed unusual morning mists settling across valleys. Winds arriving from different directions suggested changing, whether long before dark clouds reached the horizon. Experience became its own kind of education. No instrument measured generations of careful observation. Yet few teachers proved more persuasive than repeated success. One elderly estate manager might predict approaching rain merely by examining the sky before sunrise. His younger assistants perhaps smiled politely, until the rain arrived exactly as expected. Wisdom has occasionally enjoyed surprising accuracy. Let us drift toward another corner of Roman commerce. Imagine a prosperous pottery workshop operating just beyond the crowded center of the city. Stacks of freshly shaped vessels wait beneath covered shelters. Large mixing pits hold carefully prepared clay. Kilns radiate gentle warmth from yesterday's firing. Water appears everywhere. Clay requires moisture before shaping. Tools need cleaning. Finished pottery often undergoes washing before decoration. Even the workers themselves welcome cool water after hours spent beside blazing kilns. The finished amphorae will eventually transport wine, olive oil, grain, fish sauce, and countless other goods across the empire. Without water, they would never leave the workshop. Civilization often resembles an enormous chain. Every link depends quietly upon another. One curious feature of Roman cities involved their extraordinary variety. A senator's mansion might stand only a few streets away from crowded apartments housing dozens of families. Elegant gardens bordered noisy workshops. Lavish temples overlooked busy marketplaces, where merchants argued enthusiastically over prices that both sides privately considered unreasonable. The city contained remarkable contrasts. Yet everyone looked upward when rain finally arrived. The wealthy perhaps admired how efficiently their roofs directed water into carefully constructed reservoirs. The poor perhaps hoped tomorrow's fountain queues would become a little shorter. Nature displayed impressive impartiality. Clouds generally ignored social rank. What happened afterward depended rather more upon architecture. As one problem slowly faded, another quietly appeared. Stored water, useful though it was, required cleanliness. Leaves accumulated in gutters. Dust settled upon rooftops. Birds contributed materials nobody particularly welcomed into drinking supplies. Roman builders anticipated these difficulties. Many collection systems included settling basins, where heavier particles could sink before cleaner water continued into storage. Regular cleaning remained essential. Neglected cisterns eventually reminded their owners why maintenance existed. The reminder was seldom pleasant. A careful steward therefore inspected storage chambers periodically, removing accumulated sediment and checking waterproof linings for damage. The task offered little excitement. It offered considerable value. Successful households often depended upon individuals whose names never entered official records: managers, stewards, craftsmen, laborers, servants. Their quiet competence sustained daily life, while famous politicians argued publicly about considerably grander matters. History tends to remember speeches. It perhaps ought to remember dependable stewards a little more often. Imagine walking through one of Rome's marketplaces shortly after a refreshing afternoon shower. The air feels noticeably cooler. Dust has settled. Stone pavements glisten softly beneath returning sunlight. Merchants reopen awnings folded during the rain. Customers gradually return. Children discover puddles with predictable enthusiasm, despite nearby adults suggesting, quite reasonably, that sandals remain cleaner when puddles are ignored. Children have traditionally evaluated such advice with admirable independence. Nearby, fresh vegetables appear particularly vibrant after the rainfall. Lettuce, onions, herbs, figs, apples, and grapes fill wooden stalls arranged beneath woven canopies. Most of these foods owe their existence, at least in part, to careful management of water throughout the growing season. The connection is easily overlooked. The Romans understood it instinctively, perhaps because they lived much closer to the process itself. Modern people often meet food at the marketplace. Romans frequently met it in the field first. The philosopher Seneca occasionally reflected upon luxury and simplicity, observing that many of life's genuine necessities remained surprisingly modest. Water certainly belonged among them. No amount of gold could satisfy thirst by itself. Coin purchased access. It did not replace the resource. Perhaps that explains why Roman authorities devoted so much attention to protecting public supplies. Reliable water benefited everyone, regardless of social position. At least in principle. Reality, naturally, displayed somewhat greater complexity. On the royal misery scale, discovering your carefully cleaned cistern has become home to an adventurous frog earns a thoughtful 5 out of 10. The frog, one suspects, rates the arrangement considerably higher. Evening approached once again. The streets gradually cooled beneath lengthening shadows. Smoke curled gently upward from household kitchens preparing the evening meal. Lamps flickered to life behind open windows. Somewhere beyond the city walls, another quiet rain began falling across vineyards, orchards, tiled roofs, and open fields. Each drop followed its own brief journey. Some disappeared into thirsty soil. Some reached rivers that would eventually meet the sea. Others landed upon Roman rooftops, slipped through familiar channels, and settled once more into the silent reservoirs beneath homes and workshops. There they would wait with remarkable patience, asking for nothing, promising everything, quietly supporting another ordinary day in one of history's greatest cities. By the middle of the 2nd century, Rome had become a city that almost seemed impossible. Visitors arriving from smaller towns often struggled to comprehend its scale. Streets stretched farther than expected. Public buildings appeared larger than imagination had prepared them for. Temples stood beside markets, markets beside apartment blocks beside elegant private homes whose painted walls concealed quiet courtyards from the noisy world outside. The city was magnificent. It was also astonishingly complicated. Keeping such a place alive each day required a continuous flow of food, fuel, building materials, livestock, olive oil, wine, timber, stone, and above all, water. Not every necessity arrived with equal fanfare. Ships carrying Egyptian grain attracted plenty of attention. A well-maintained cistern attracted almost none. Yet one interruption could quickly make the other rather less useful. A city could not eat marble, nor could it drink architecture. The Romans understood this balance remarkably well. Their admiration for engineering was never limited to beautiful buildings. They appreciated systems. Roads connected provinces to markets. Harbors linked sea routes with inland trade. Bridges shortened difficult journeys. Aqueducts transformed distant springs into dependable urban resources. Each achievement solved practical problems. Practicality, though rarely glamorous, tends to survive for a very long time. One morning, let us imagine accompanying a surveyor responsible for inspecting part of the city's water infrastructure. His tools appear surprisingly simple. Measuring rods, lengths of cord, wax tablets for recording observations, perhaps a few assistants carrying additional equipment. No elaborate machines accompany him. Instead, he relies upon careful measurement, experience, and an eye trained to notice small irregularities before they become expensive ones. A section of stone lining has shifted slightly. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, but left unattended, winter rains may enlarge the damage. Water possesses extraordinary patience. It rarely hurries. It simply continues. A tiny crack becomes a larger one. A larger crack eventually becomes someone else's urgent problem. The surveyor makes a note. Repairs will be organized. Civilizations often continue functioning because someone quietly writes practical notes that other people actually read. History owes a surprising debt to paperwork. Meanwhile, across the city, another ordinary Roman begins his own working day. He is not a senator, not a famous general, not even especially wealthy. He owns several storage warehouses near one of the busier commercial districts, together with adjoining workshops and rental properties. His business depends less upon dramatic opportunity than dependable organization. He inspects roofs regularly, not because he particularly enjoys climbing ladders, because neglected roofs become expensive roofs. Seasonal rain, therefore, represents something slightly different in his calculations. Others see weather. He sees maintenance schedules, storage capacity, operating costs, future reliability. It is an unromantic perspective. It is also frequently profitable. The Roman economy rewarded people capable of thinking beyond tomorrow. Warehouses storing grain required dry interiors throughout the year. Roofs directed rainwater away from valuable cargo, while simultaneously collecting portions of it for cleaning, construction, livestock, or other practical purposes. Every useful drop reduced dependence upon more expensive alternatives. The rain itself cost nothing. The preparation certainly did. One begins to understand why successful Roman property owners often devoted careful attention to architecture. A poorly designed building wasted opportunities every time clouds passed overhead. A well-designed one quietly converted ordinary rainfall into long-term advantage. Nobody celebrated such achievements during triumphal parades. Account books, however, notice the difference. Let's drift gently toward another aspect of Roman life. Education. Children from wealthier families often studied reading, writing, arithmetic, literature, rhetoric, and philosophy under private tutors or local teachers. Lessons frequently took place beneath covered walkways or inside modest classrooms, where wax tablets replaced modern notebooks. Discipline could be strict, very strict. Roman teachers generally believed learning required considerable effort. Their students occasionally held different opinions. One wonders whether homework has ever enjoyed universal popularity. Among the texts students encountered were works discussing agriculture, law, engineering, and natural philosophy. Knowledge passed steadily from one generation to the next. Building techniques improved gradually. Estate management became increasingly sophisticated. Practical wisdom accumulated patiently across centuries. Much of that wisdom involved understanding local environments. Where does rain collect naturally? Which slopes drain efficiently? How large should storage facilities become? How frequently must they be cleaned? Simple questions. Remarkably important answers. Roman builders recognized that every landscape possessed its own personality. Houses constructed along steep hillsides required different drainage solutions than homes standing on flatter ground. Coastal regions faced challenges unlike inland valleys. Adaptation became a quiet hallmark of Roman engineering. Perhaps this flexibility explains why so many examples remain standing today. Rigid systems often break. Adaptable ones frequently endure. Outside the city, country estates prepared for another harvest. Workers moved among olive trees carrying woven baskets. Others inspected grapevines heavy with fruit almost ready for gathering. The estate owner observed everything with practiced attention. He understood that weather during the next several weeks might determine the year's financial success. Rain arriving too early complicated harvesting. Rain arriving too late accomplished rather little. Nature retained the final word. Human planning merely attempted polite negotiation. Roman agricultural writers repeatedly encouraged moderation. Do not rely upon fortune alone. Prepare carefully. Maintain equipment. Inspect buildings. Store resources wisely. These recommendations appear almost boring at first glance. History quietly demonstrates their effectiveness. Successful civilizations often become slightly repetitive. They repair what needs repairing. They preserve what deserves preserving. They repeat sensible habits until those habits begin to resemble tradition. On the royal misery scale, postponing roof repairs because it probably won't rain this week earns a confident 8 out of 10. The weather, naturally, has not been consulted and proceeds according to its own schedule. As afternoon sunlight softened toward evening, the city's fountains remained busy. Women filled clay jars before returning home. Laborers washed dust from their hands after long hours of work. Travelers paused briefly, grateful for cool water before continuing along Roman roads stretching toward provinces hundreds of miles away. Roads and water. Two of Rome's greatest achievements. One allowed movement. The other made settlement possible. Together they supported an empire that connected peoples, languages, climates, and cultures on a scale few earlier civilizations had imagined. Merchants arriving from distant regions brought unfamiliar goods and equally unfamiliar stories. Silks from the East, amber from the Baltic, spices from Arabia, glass from Syria, papyrus from Egypt. The markets of Rome became a meeting place not only for commerce but for ideas. Some visitors undoubtedly admired the city's monumental architecture. Others noticed something less obvious: the remarkable reliability of everyday life. Fresh water flowing from public fountains, well-maintained baths, clean drainage in wealthier districts, orderly distribution systems. These practical comforts quietly distinguished Rome from many other ancient cities. They did not eliminate hardship. They reduced it. Civilization often advances through reductions in inconvenience rather than spectacular transformations. Imagine spending an evening inside one of Rome's quieter neighborhoods after a gentle summer rain. The streets remain damp. The day's heat has finally begun to fade. Open windows allow cooler air to drift through family homes. The faint sound of water still trickles somewhere beneath the paving stones, as excess rain continues moving through carefully designed channels toward larger drains. Children have finally stopped playing outside. Merchants close heavy wooden shutters. Dogs settle into familiar corners. Oil lamps flicker gently against painted walls. Below those walls, underground reservoirs receive the last small streams of rainwater filtering through collection systems designed generations earlier. No audience watches. No poet records the moment. No senator delivers a speech celebrating another successfully filled cistern. Yet somewhere, a careful steward quietly smiles after checking the water level before locking the storeroom for the night. He understands something easy to overlook. Tomorrow will almost certainly function more smoothly because of yesterday's preparation. It is not the sort of realization that earns statues, but it has helped build civilizations for thousands of years. Another season gradually settled across the Roman world. The intense heat of late summer softened into the gentler days of autumn, and with that change came a quiet sense of anticipation. Farmers looked toward the skies with renewed optimism. Builders hurried to finish repairs before heavier winter rains arrived. Merchants checked the roofs of their warehouses once again, making certain that every loose tile had been secured and every drainage channel remained clear. Experience had taught them a simple lesson. Rain was wonderfully useful. Rain arriving through a damaged roof was considerably less so. Across the empire, millions of roof tiles waited patiently for the changing weather. Unlike the magnificent marble temples or triumphal arches that attracted admiring visitors, these ordinary clay tiles rarely inspired poetry. Yet together they formed one of Rome's largest collection systems. Every shower became an opportunity. Every well-maintained roof quietly gathered a resource that no government could manufacture and no merchant could import. It simply arrived, provided the clouds agreed. The Romans often described good fortune as something granted by the gods, but they rarely expected divine generosity to replace sensible preparation. Religious ceremonies certainly formed part of public life. Offerings were made. Festivals filled the calendar. Priests observed rituals that had been repeated for generations. Then everyone went back to repairing buildings. Faith and practicality lived quite comfortably beside one another. One sought blessing. The other cleaned the gutters. Imagine a respectable Roman villa standing among rolling vineyards outside the city. The estate has belonged to the same family for decades, perhaps even generations. Its walls have been repaired countless times. Its orchards expanded gradually. Its storage buildings improved little by little, whenever finances allowed. Nothing about the property appeared especially revolutionary. That was precisely its strength. Roman prosperity often accumulated slowly. One additional field, one better harvest, one carefully purchased neighboring plot of land, one improved cistern capable of storing enough rainwater to protect the estate through another difficult summer. The progress almost escaped notice, until someone compared the estate to what it had been 50 years earlier. Quiet improvements have a habit of becoming impressive with enough time. The owner begins his morning walk accompanied by the estate steward. Neither man speaks very much. There is little need. Both know exactly what requires inspection. The vineyards appear healthy. Stone walls remain secure. The olive presses have been cleaned after the previous season. Finally, they reach the largest underground reservoir. The steward removes a heavy wooden cover. Cool air rises immediately from below. The water level looks excellent. The owner nods with quiet satisfaction. No celebration follows. He simply replaces the cover and continues walking. Some victories are measured in confidence rather than applause. The steward understands that a full cistern means more than full cisterns alone. It means the household kitchen will continue functioning comfortably. The livestock will remain supplied. The gardens surrounding the villa will survive another dry spell. The servants will spend less time carrying water from distant wells. The vineyards themselves possess a reserve should unusually harsh weather arrive. Preparedness creates freedom. The Romans appreciated that, even if they rarely described it in those exact words. Meanwhile, several days' journey away, another Roman city greets the first substantial rainfall of the season. Children laugh while running beneath covered walkways. Shopkeepers briefly pause their business to secure awnings. Travelers seek shelter beneath porticos until the strongest showers pass. Stone streets become reflective ribbons of silver. Water rushes toward drains designed centuries earlier. Some channels disappear beneath the city, carrying excess water safely away. Others feed public reservoirs. Still others vanish into countless private collection systems hidden beneath homes, workshops, and warehouses. The rain itself treats everyone equally. Architecture determines what happens next. There is a quiet elegance in that idea. Preparation often transforms ordinary events into valuable opportunities. Without preparation, rain becomes inconvenience. With preparation, it becomes security. Perhaps that principle extends rather further than Roman plumbing. As one problem slowly faded, another quietly appeared. Water storage solved many difficulties. It also demanded responsibility. Standing water required occasional inspection. Storage chambers accumulated sediment. Filters needed cleaning after storms. Roofs required repairs following strong winds. Even the finest engineering gradually surrendered to neglect if nobody cared for it. The Romans knew this, perhaps because they had inherited structures built by earlier generations. Perhaps because they hoped future generations would inherit theirs. A civilization thinking beyond a single lifetime builds differently. Roman concrete deserves particular admiration here. By combining lime, volcanic ash, and carefully selected aggregates, Roman builders produced materials remarkably resistant to moisture. Modern researchers continue studying many surviving structures with considerable fascination. Ancient builders probably would have found that amusing. They simply wanted the walls to remain standing. Success occasionally exceeds expectations. One curious detail of Roman daily life involved household accounting. Many prosperous families employed stewards responsible for recording every significant expense. Wax tablets filled with neat handwriting documented purchases of grain, lamp oil, livestock, timber, wages, repairs, and maintenance. Nothing escaped attention for very long. The replacement of damaged roof tiles, payment to stone masons repairing drainage channels, cleaning of storage cisterns, transport of fresh building materials. Small expenses accumulated quietly. Ignoring them usually proved considerably more expensive later. Bookkeeping has rescued more fortunes than dramatic inspiration. It simply receives fewer stories. Let's drift gently toward one of Rome's marketplaces shortly before sunset. The busiest hours have passed. Fruit sellers arrange the remaining figs and grapes more neatly, hoping to attract a few final customers before darkness arrives. Fish merchants prepare to close. The smell suggests this is probably a wise decision. Nearby, a potter carefully examines newly fired storage jars. Large amphorae stand in orderly rows beside smaller household vessels. Some will carry wine, others olive oil, others grain. Still others will store water collected from the next rainfall. The jars themselves appear unremarkable, yet choosing the right container mattered enormously. A cracked vessel slowly transformed abundance into disappointment. Roman craftsmen therefore developed reputations based upon reliability rather than decoration alone. A beautiful storage jar leaking quietly through its base represented an expensive misunderstanding. Quality had practical consequences. The same principle guided builders throughout the empire. A properly constructed roof collected water efficiently. A poorly designed one introduced rain into bedrooms. History has demonstrated repeatedly which option household owners preferred. As evening deepened, smoke drifted gently upward from hundreds of kitchen fires. Families gathered once again around simple meals. Some discussed local politics. Others planned tomorrow's work. Children gradually became sleepy after another energetic day, apparently dedicated to discovering every possible source of mischief. Parents throughout history have admired this talent with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Outside, clouds continued moving eastward beneath the stars. Another light shower passed quietly across the countryside. Roofs accepted it without complaint. Courtyards welcomed it. Fields absorbed it. Hidden cisterns received it. No one hurried outside to applaud. There was no need. The buildings themselves understood their task. On the royal misery scale, discovering after 3 months of drought that your neighbor maintained his rainwater system while you postponed yours for another weekend, earns a reflective 9 out of 10. The conversation that follows across the garden wall is likely to remain politely memorable. By now, one begins to appreciate that Rome's greatness rested upon more than emperors, armies, and monuments. It rested equally upon ordinary habits repeated patiently across generations. Checking roofs before winter, cleaning channels after storms, repairing cracked stone before greater damage appeared, storing resources while they remained plentiful, preparing quietly for seasons not yet arrived. These actions rarely entered official histories. Yet they helped ensure that when tomorrow's sun rose above the city once again, fountains would continue flowing, workshops would reopen, kitchens would prepare bread, merchants would unlock their warehouses, and another ordinary Roman day would begin with the calm confidence that somewhere beneath the streets, yesterday's rainfall was already waiting to help. By now, after drifting through so many quiet corners of the Roman world, it becomes easier to understand that water was never simply water. It was security. It was planning. It was comfort. It was commerce. And in countless subtle ways, it was wealth. Not necessarily the sort of wealth displayed through jeweled rings or marble statues, although Rome certainly possessed plenty of both. Rather, it was the quieter kind of prosperity that arrived when households functioned smoothly. Harvests survived difficult summers, workshops remained productive, and merchants avoided interruptions that might otherwise consume both time and money. The Romans admired grand victories. Daily life admired reliability. As dawn spread across the Campagna beyond Rome, a light mist rested over fields still cool from the night before. Dew shimmered on vines, and distant hills appeared softened by the morning haze. Shepherds guided flocks toward fresh grazing, while farm workers began another day whose success depended less upon dramatic inspiration than upon countless familiar routines. Someone inspected fencing. Someone sharpened tools. Someone counted livestock. Someone checked the water. No one considered these activities extraordinary. That was precisely why they mattered. Civilizations are rarely sustained by extraordinary moments alone. They endure through ordinary mornings, repeated across generations. One estate larger than most stretched across several hundred acres of vineyards, olive groves, grain fields, orchards, and woodland. Its owner rarely performed the physical labor himself, but he understood that good management required regular presence. He walked the property often, not hurriedly, not ceremoniously, simply attentively. The estate steward accompanied him, carrying wax tablets filled with neat records. How much grain remained in storage? How many olive trees required pruning? Which roofs needed repair before winter? Whether the cistern near the western vineyard required cleaning after recent storms? The conversation remained practical. Success generally does. The owner eventually paused beside one of the larger reservoirs. Its stone lining had survived another year without significant damage. Rain collected during previous months still rested quietly below. He smiled with quiet satisfaction. Not because water itself seemed remarkable. Because dependable water meant predictable harvests, healthier workers, fewer interruptions, and ultimately, stronger financial accounts. Prosperity often begins with predictability. Predictability begins with preparation. The Romans rarely separated these ideas. Meanwhile, back in Rome itself, another sort of preparation occupied the attention of builders. The city never truly stopped changing. Older buildings received repairs. New houses appeared where land became available. Warehouses expanded near commercial districts. Public officials occasionally announced improvements intended to benefit growing neighborhoods. Construction demanded immense quantities of materials: stone, timber, brick, lime, sand, and inevitably water. Mortar without water remained stubbornly dry powder. Concrete required careful mixing. Freshly laid masonry depended upon moisture while curing. Even Rome's famous monuments quietly owed part of their existence to countless buckets carried by laborers whose names history has forgotten. Perhaps forgotten is not entirely the right word. More accurately, history simply lacked enough pages. One curious feature of Roman engineering involved redundancy. Where practical, experienced builders preferred having more than one solution available. A villa might possess both a well and several rain-fed cisterns. A town could rely upon springs while also maintaining public reservoirs. An estate owner sometimes invested in additional storage, despite already possessing adequate supplies. Some observers might have considered such caution unnecessary, until the first unusually dry season arrived. Preparedness often appears excessive immediately before proving indispensable. There is a gentle lesson hidden there. As one problem slowly faded, another quietly appeared. Success itself created new expectations. A growing city required increasing amounts of fresh water. Public baths expanded. Gardens became more elaborate. Fountains multiplied. Population continued rising. Administrators therefore faced continual pressure to preserve existing infrastructure while planning future improvements. Rome's water system represented a remarkable achievement. It was never finished. Perhaps no successful system ever truly is. Maintenance continued. Repairs continued. Inspection continued. The work passed quietly from one generation of engineers to the next. There is something comforting about that continuity. People changed. Responsibilities remained. Let's drift gently into one of Rome's libraries. Scrolls line wooden shelves from floor to ceiling. The room smells faintly of papyrus, wax, timber, and lamp oil. Scholars move quietly between tables copying manuscripts with careful handwriting that demands both patience and good eyesight. Among these texts rest the works of agricultural writers, architects, philosophers, historians, and engineers. Knowledge itself becomes another kind of reservoir. Collected carefully, preserved thoughtfully, passed onward. Vitruvius, the great Roman architect, wrote extensively about building design, water supply, and engineering principles. His work reminds us that Roman construction seldom relied upon guesswork alone. Observation mattered. Experience mattered. Measurement mattered. Builders learned from previous generations and expected future generations to improve upon their efforts. There is an admirable humility in that approach. Every civilization inherits something. Every civilization leaves something behind. Outside once again, clouds gathered above the distant hills. The weather had followed familiar patterns throughout the year, though no Roman would have presumed complete confidence in tomorrow's forecast. Experience encouraged expectation. Never certainty. A shepherd glanced upward briefly before encouraging his flock toward shelter. Farmers noticed changing winds. Household servants secured loose items within courtyards. The first drops arrived quietly. Stone darkened. Dust settled. The familiar scent of rain drifted gently across fields and city streets alike. Once more, rooftops throughout the empire began performing the task for which they had been carefully designed. Water slipped along curved tiles, into channels, across stone basins, down narrow conduits, finally disappearing into cool darkness below ground. Gravity completed another day's work. Without complaint, without applause, one almost begins to admire gravity as an honorary Roman civil servant. Its attendance record remained flawless. Inside a merchant's warehouse, workers paused briefly while rain drummed softly upon the roof overhead. The owner listened almost absent-mindedly. To many people, it sounded simply like weather. To him, it sounded like reservoirs quietly filling. Storage jars waiting to be used. Cleaning supplies replenished. Future expenses reduced. Every successful merchant eventually develops the habit of hearing opportunities where others notice only background noise. Not every opportunity arrives loudly. Some arrive one raindrop at a time. On the royal misery scale, realizing halfway through a magnificent rainstorm that you forgot to reconnect the collection channel after cleaning it comfortably earns an 8 out of 10. Watching several hours of perfectly useful water disappear into the street tends to encourage much better organization next season. Night settled over the countryside once more. Oil lamps flickered inside villas. Dogs barked somewhere in the distance before deciding the matter was no longer especially urgent. The rain gradually eased. Small streams continued their quiet journey through fields toward rivers. Elsewhere, hidden reservoirs accepted the final drops of another passing storm. Everything became still again. It is tempting to imagine history as a sequence of famous names and dramatic events. Emperors crowned, battles fought, kingdoms conquered. Yet beneath those larger stories flowed quieter ones. The careful steward inspecting a cistern, the builder repairing a damaged roof, the surveyor measuring an aqueduct, the farmer watching approaching clouds, the merchant calculating whether today's rain might reduce tomorrow's costs. They rarely appeared in grand histories. Nevertheless, they helped sustain the world those histories describe. Perhaps that is the true lesson quietly offered by Roman rainwater. Great civilizations are not supported by extraordinary achievements alone. They are upheld, day after day, by ordinary people performing ordinary tasks with extraordinary consistency. And somewhere beneath the stone streets of Rome, in cool chambers hidden from sunlight, yesterday's rainfall continued waiting patiently for tomorrow's needs, just as it had done for generations before, and just as careful Romans intended it would for generations still to come. And so, after many quiet days wandering through the streets, villas, workshops, farms, harbors, and hidden chambers of the Roman world, we arrive not at a dramatic conclusion, but at something far more fitting. An ordinary morning. The sun rises over Rome just as it has for countless generations. Its first light touches the highest points of the city before slowly descending toward the streets below. The roofs of temples glow softly. Marble columns catch a warm golden color. Birds begin their familiar conversations long before the markets fully awaken. The city stretches lazily into another day. A baker opens his shutters. A farmer steps into a vineyard still damp with dew. A merchant unlocks the heavy doors of his warehouse. A servant lowers a bucket into a cool underground cistern. Life continues. If someone from the modern world could quietly observe this scene without disturbing it, they might initially be drawn toward Rome's greatest monuments. The Colosseum, the Forum, the temples, the triumphal arches, the immense public baths. Each deserves admiration. Yet after spending enough time here, another truth begins to emerge. The city was not sustained by monuments alone. It survived because thousands of invisible systems worked together every single day. Roads carried grain. Ports welcomed ships. Markets distributed goods. Laws settled disputes. Aqueducts supplied water. Roofs collected rain. Cisterns stored it. One achievement supported another. The Romans understood something that many civilizations eventually discover for themselves. Prosperity is rarely created by one magnificent idea. It grows from countless sensible decisions repeated over generations. Repairing a damaged roof before winter. Cleaning a drainage channel before the first heavy storm. Inspecting stonework before a crack becomes a collapse. Keeping careful financial records. Preparing for difficult seasons while easier ones still last. These habits seem almost too ordinary to deserve attention. Yet they quietly shape history. There is something deeply reassuring about that. Grand ambitions often depend upon modest routines. Let us spend a little longer with one Roman family. Not an imperial household. Not one celebrated by historians. Simply a prosperous family living comfortably inside a well-built domus. The grandfather remembers years when drought tested the city. His son remembers repairing the cistern after a small earthquake loosened part of its stone lining. His grandchildren know little about either event. To them, fresh water simply appears whenever needed. That is often the greatest compliment any system can receive. When the next generation barely notices how much work previous generations invested. Civilizations succeed most completely when ordinary life feels ordinary. A child filling a cup rarely thinks about engineers. A gardener watering herbs seldom reflects upon architects. A merchant washing his hands before dinner probably does not pause to thank generations of builders who perfected waterproof mortar. Success has become invisible. Invisible success is still success. Perhaps especially so. Meanwhile, elsewhere across the empire, another household follows similar routines beneath a different sky. In Hispania, rain fills courtyard reservoirs after a welcome autumn storm. In Gaul, builders inspect stone channels before winter frosts arrive. In North Africa, carefully maintained cisterns preserve precious seasonal rainfall beneath warm sunlight. In Syria, merchants crossing long caravan routes appreciate every reliable well waiting along familiar roads. Different provinces, different climates, the same quiet understanding. Water deserves respect. Preparation deserves reward. The Roman Empire connected lands of astonishing diversity. Languages changed. Foods changed. Clothing changed. Local customs changed. Yet practical wisdom traveled remarkably well. Collect what nature provides. Store it carefully. Protect it from waste. Repair what breaks. Think ahead. Simple advice. Exceptionally durable advice. One curious irony remains. Modern visitors often marvel at surviving aqueducts. Photographs capture elegant arches stretching across valleys. Tourists stand beneath them, imagining the extraordinary civilization capable of such engineering. Few people ask about the countless cisterns quietly hidden beneath ordinary houses. Perhaps because they remain hidden. Perhaps because greatness beneath the ground attracts fewer paintings. Yet without those reservoirs, daily Roman life would have looked rather different. Sometimes history's greatest supporting characters never appear on stage. As one generation passed into another, emperors came and went. Some ruled wisely. Some ruled with considerably more enthusiasm than judgment. Naturally, a few managed to complicate situations that had previously functioned perfectly well. Rome continued regardless. Administrators replaced one another. Engineers trained new apprentices. Builders repaired old structures. Farmers watched familiar skies. Merchants balanced familiar accounts. The rain kept falling. Gravity kept working. The seasons kept turning. Empires, for all their confidence, still relied upon clouds drifting quietly across the Mediterranean. There is something wonderfully humbling about that thought. On the royal misery scale, attempting to argue with gravity still earns a perfect 10 out of 10. Gravity has remained entirely unconvinced for several billion years and shows no sign of changing its position. The Roman world eventually changed as all civilizations do. Political structures evolved. Trade routes shifted. Cities expanded, contracted, and transformed. Some magnificent buildings fell into ruin. Others found entirely new purposes. Yet many of the practical ideas developed by Roman engineers continued influencing generations that followed. Rainwater harvesting never truly disappeared. Builders across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East continued constructing cisterns. Monasteries preserved them. Castles incorporated them. Country estates relied upon them. Even today, many communities throughout the world still collect rainwater using principles that Roman builders would have recognized immediately. Technology has advanced. The clouds remain remarkably traditional. Perhaps that is the quiet charm of history. The farther we travel into the past, the more familiar certain ideas become. People still prepare for uncertain seasons. They still repair homes before winter. They still value dependable supplies. They still discover that patient maintenance often proves less expensive than dramatic repairs. Some lessons require no updating. As evening slowly returns to our imagined Rome one final time, the streets become peaceful once more. Oil lamps glow behind wooden shutters. The laughter from taverns grows softer with distance. The day's final carts rumble across worn paving stones before disappearing into quieter neighborhoods. Above the city, stars appear one by one. Somewhere beyond the hills, gentle rain begins falling once again. No one rushes to celebrate. No speeches are delivered. No trumpets announce its arrival. The rooftops simply receive it. Water flows along familiar paths. Stone basins welcome it. Underground reservoirs fill quietly in the darkness. Tomorrow's bread. Tomorrow's gardens. Tomorrow's workshops. Tomorrow's ordinary miracles. All beginning with another peaceful rainfall. And perhaps that is the real story hidden behind the title of our journey. Not of one extraordinary Roman who discovered unimaginable riches in a single brilliant moment, but of an entire civilization that understood the quiet value of ordinary things. A society that learned how to transform something as humble as rain into security, comfort, prosperity, and resilience. Because true wealth, more often than not, is built slowly. One careful decision. One repaired roof. One well-maintained cistern. One season at a time. And so our sleepy journey comes to an end. History rarely learned all of its lessons. Rulers rarely stopped making surprisingly complicated decisions. And somehow humanity kept moving forward anyway. The rain continued to fall. The reservoirs continued to fill. The seasons continued to turn. And somewhere, beneath the quiet stones of ancient Rome, yesterday's rainfall waited patiently for tomorrow, just as it always had. Sleep well,